We're all anxious to hear from our speakers, so I'll go through their introductions briefly. As you will note, they both have responsibilities which keep them very involved in the upcoming summit. I'll introduce them in reverse order of their appearances. Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall is a person of multiple titles and many responsibilities. Since January 2009, she has held the titles of Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for European Affairs on the National Security Staff. Immediately prior to her appointment by the President, she was an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a senior researcher at the Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. She was also a founding senior advisor to the Stanford-Harvard Preventative Defense Project. This is the second time that Sherwood-Randall has served in the executive branch. She served in the Clinton administration from 1994 to 1996 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. While at the Pentagon, she was instrumental in extending NATO's Partnership for Peace program across Eurasia and building the foundation for cooperation between Russia and NATO in the joint peacekeeping operation in Bosnia. For her work, she was awarded the Department of Defense Distinguished Service Medal in 1996. Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall is the author of many articles and is considered an expert on NATO and American security. Ben Rhodes. Ben Rhodes also has a large and varied portfolio. He serves as Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, which means he oversees President Obama's national security communications, speech writing, and global engagement. Previously, he was Deputy Director of White House Speech Writing and has been a speechwriter for President Obama since 2007, when the President was a junior senator. In 2002, he began as a special assistant to Lee Hamilton, President of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and while at the Wilson Center, he helped draft the Iraq Study Group Report, the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, and in 2006, he co-authored the book Without Precedent, The Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. In 2011, Ben Rhodes was included in Time Magazine's 40 Under 40 list of powerful and prominent young professionals. At that time, Time Magazine asked him, "What is the most overlooked issue facing America today?" He answered, "We need a broad and sustainable consensus about the politics of national security and America's role in the world, which we have not had in the 21st century." Prescient words, to be sure. It's my pleasure to welcome Ben Rhodes and Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the Chicago Council for organizing this and all the other events that have been leading into the summit. It's been an extraordinary service, I think, to connect the people of Chicago to this very important international event. And I'm pleased to be joined here by, of course, Liz and the three ambassadors from such important allies of the United States. I will say to the Czech ambassador, when I was first beginning in my job, our first foreign trip to Europe was going to be to the Czech Republic, among other countries. And the Czech ambassador, your predecessor, got word of the fact that the president was going to give a big speech in the Czech Republic. So he came in to see me, and he offered his thoughts, and he gave me a gift, which was a giant, oversized pop-up book called The History of the Great Czech People. And it speaks to the humor of the Czech Republic. I have that still in my office, and people come and see all these serious policy books on the shelf, but then they take this down and open it up, and there's a pop-up of the Charles Bridge, and I think, again, it's a memento that I'll carry with me. I also mentioned earlier this morning, when we were looking at what city in the United States would host the NATO summit, we considered a number. The president very much wanted to take the summit outside of Washington so he could showcase and highlight an American city. And there were a number of reasons that we chose Chicago. One is just that it's a global city capable of hosting such a significant event. Two, of course, it's the president's hometown, and he always looks for reasons and excuses to get back here. But also, he is very proud of the city, and as Liz and I were noting today, in recent meetings with foreign leaders, he's been bragging about Chicago and saying, you're not going to believe what you're going to see. Chicago's going to put on a great show. Third, of course, was your incredibly diplomatic and soft-spoken mayor, who's very well known to some of us in the White House, and was an advocate for Chicago, of course. But I think also the diversity of the people of Chicago, and a diversity that speaks to the diversity of NATO as well. Earlier today, for instance, we spoke with some of the Baltic community here in Chicago, and the Lithuanian ambassador was there. I mentioned the story, too, of how I came to appreciate more the diaspora populations from Central and Eastern Europe back in the United States. When I was working on that speech that the president gave in Prague, we had learned a lesson from the speech he gave in Berlin, where you had 250,000 people outside. Germans speak very good English, but it's still hard for them to follow and know exactly what the president's saying. So to make sure that we didn't have that challenge again, we had jumbotrons up in this square in Prague and 25,000 Czechs. And I said to the embassy, we need a translator so we can give them the text of the speech the night before, and the speech can play on the jumbotron. And when we got to our hotel, I asked the embassy, where's the translator? And they said, oh, the translator's in Virginia. So I ended up having to call back and read the speech to someone to translate it back in the United States so it could be posted up on the screen in Prague. And the biggest applause lines, of course, had to do with Chicago and the fact that there are so many Czechs from Chicago. But with that, I'll just say a few words here about our goals for the summit. And I think, first of all, the reason the president wanted to host the NATO summit in general is because alliances are central to his foreign policy and central to his view of the world. He very much believes that the United States is far stronger when we're working in concert with others and building coalitions to share burdens and deal with common challenges. And when we came into office, we had a number of immediate things that we had to deal with on the foreign policy and national security side. Things, of course, that extended back into the previous administration, whether it was ending the war in Iraq on a responsible timeline, refocusing our efforts on al-Qaeda, stabilizing Afghanistan, which was going to take additional resources, a number of urgent challenges before us, securing loose nuclear weapons and materials around the world, and of course dealing with the global economic crisis. But even as we were dealing with the inbox of national security, the president set about to strengthen the foundations of how America engages in the world. And really the core foundation is our alliance and our alliance with Europe and our alliance with NATO. That's because these are countries with whom we share democratic values. And at a time when there are competing ideologies and systems in the world, as is always the case, we believe that America is stronger and more prosperous when more countries are democratic. And the clearest instance of that is the extraordinary security and prosperity that has come from the enlargement of peace, security, and democracy in Europe. These are countries with whom we share common interests. When we sit across the table from our European allies, we agree with them about a lot more than we disagree with them. And Liz and I have been in more than one meeting with the president where he's had a difficult meeting with let's just say a non-ally, and then meets with one of our European friends, and afterwards he'll say to us, sometimes it's really good to have allies. But these are countries with whom we share common interests. These are countries with whom we need to consolidate the gains of the 20th century. And we spoke earlier today about the fact that even as we have a global view as Americans, even as we're preoccupied often with events in the Middle East and North Africa and Afghanistan, and even as we are working very aggressively to take our foreign policy into the Asia-Pacific region and increase our reach and our markets into that fast-growing part of the world, that we very much still see Europe as the cornerstone of our engagement, and that includes consolidating European security and making sure that, again, Europe remains whole, free, and at peace, and that the progress we've seen, for instance, among our Central and Eastern European friends over the course of the last 20 years is extended not just within those countries, but to the remaining part of Europe's periphery that has not completed that journey yet. And the other thing I'd say is Europe is our partner of first resort, our partner of first choice for working on global issues. Europe and America work together in just about every challenge that we face. And the President spoke about this when he was in London. And he went through our shared cooperation on economic issues, on security issues, and he told the story of our intervention in Libya, where we intervened with our European allies and stopped a massacre and ultimately ended the Gaddafi regime. And part of his message was, after telling that story, if we didn't do this, who would? There's nobody else in the world, no other country, that seeks to play the role that the United States and Europe play together in the world. There's a lot of talk about China and its rising economy. But even with its growing economic influence, you don't, for instance, see China seeking to play that type of role in expanding global security, certainly expanding human rights and development and global health as the United States and Europe do together. So for all those reasons, because of those shared interests, those shared values, and that shared sense of responsibility to one another and to the rest of the world, the transatlantic alliance and the European friendship that we have and the NATO alliance that we have has been at the core of the President's effort to strengthen that foundation of American foreign policy. All of this will intersect here in Chicago, where we'll have dozens of heads of state. And I'll just say a few words about the summit, and then I know Liz will add on the NATO piece in particular. There are really three broad categories that we've highlighted for what we're trying to achieve in Chicago. The first is making sure that NATO continues to have the capabilities it needs to be the premier security alliance in the 21st century as it has been in the past. And again, in a context of cutting budgets and fiscal austerity in much of our countries, this is going to have to involve very smart decisions by our governments and by our alliance so that nations are investing in the right things and the alliance can serve as a force multiplier. And Liz will talk about a number of those important capabilities that we'll be focusing on, like missile defense, for instance, here in Chicago. Second, we're going to focus on partnerships. And what we mean by this is NATO as a hub of a global network of relationships. We have consolidated the North Atlantic community within an enlarged NATO. We have an open door policy where we're continuing to discuss NATO membership with aspirants. But we also work globally in Asia, for instance, with countries like Korea and Japan and Australia. In Libya, for instance, for the first time, you had Arab countries, Gulf states, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Jordan operating under a NATO command. And essentially, we want to build a network of relationships with non-NATO member states, but states that can cooperate with us and expand the reach of the NATO alliance so it is truly global and it can deal with challenges like terrorism and piracy and cyber threats that are increasingly going to drive the security environment of the 21st century. But of course, we're going to be dealing with Afghanistan. And I'll just say a few words about this because I think, of course, it'll be a major focus of the NATO summit. And the way we've looked at it is there's been several important milestones in the President's Afghanistan policy. Of course, when he took office, we felt the situation had drifted. As with our efforts against al-Qaeda, the attention had shifted to Iraq. And we sought to reorient American national security policy so that we could end the war in Iraq, increase resources into Afghanistan, increase resources against al-Qaeda, so as to effectively, ultimately wind down that conflict as well. And there have been a number of key milestones. The President's decision in December of 2009 to put in substantial additional resources, of course, which was accompanied by additional resources by our allies. That led up to his announcement, our announcement in Lisbon, together with NATO allies in December of 2010, where we came together and agreed on a transition plan, whereby we would begin to transition to Afghanistan control of parts of the country in 2011 and complete a process of transition by 2014. And that created a framework for essentially how we would begin to wind down our involvement in Afghanistan while also looking to an enduring relationship with the government and security forces of Afghanistan after 2014. We've, of course, in the context of this, continued our efforts against al-Qaeda and made significant gains against what was our core goal, of course, which was defeating al-Qaeda and denying it the chance to reestablish a safe haven in Afghanistan. And on Tuesday, we'll mark 1 year from the operation that took out Osama bin Laden, which I think is the clearest manifestation of that effort. Following on that operation and the beginning of transition in Afghanistan, last June, President Obama announced that we would begin to draw down American forces within the context of the Lisbon transition. So 33,000 American troops total he ordered home by the end of this summer, the summer of 2012. 10,000 of those troops left last year, and we're out by December. Another 23,000 will be drawn down by the end of this summer. And he made clear, the President did at that time, that we would be continuing those reductions at a steady pace, but a responsible one alongside our NATO allies as the transition moves forward. We won't be announcing troop numbers in Chicago. What we'll be discussing is the next phase of this process of transition from where we are now. So when President Obama announced that we would host the NATO summit this May, he was very clear that this would be the next milestone. This summit will be the next time for the alliance to come together with the Afghan government and discuss where we stand in Afghanistan and what the next phase is going forward. And we've been in very intensive discussions with our NATO partners and with our ISAF partners and with Afghanistan, and most recently in Brussels. Now, it's important to understand that transition, this process of handing over responsibility to the Afghans, is already underway. Approximately 50% of the Afghan population is currently living in areas that have already transitioned or are transitioning to Afghan lead, which means that the Afghan security forces are in the front and responsible for securing those areas. Meanwhile, the Afghan security forces themselves are growing both in number and capability. And in Chicago, we expect leaders to come together. They'll reaffirm the Lisbon framework for transition, but they'll also look towards an interim milestone in 2013 when Afghan security forces will move into the lead for combat operations. Coalition forces will move into a support role. In some parts of the country, of course, we would continue to fight alongside Afghan forces, but increasingly this would advance that phase of transition so that the Afghans are moving forward and taking responsibility for their country. Increasingly, we are doing training, advising, assisting to those Afghan forces. By the end of 2014, as agreed to in Lisbon, this transition will be complete, and Afghan security forces and the Afghan government will be fully responsible for the security of their country. We'll, of course, continue to be able to train, advise, and assist them throughout this process. But as we did in Iraq, what we'll see is a gradual handover of responsibility over time. What we'll also be discussing at the summit is how do we support Afghanistan going forward? Because we believe we can meet our objective. We can meet our objective of defeating al-Qaeda. We can meet our objective of building competent Afghan security forces and an Afghan government that can stand on its own 2 feet. But we need to make sure that after we reduce our presence, that al-Qaeda is not able to regenerate and the Afghan government is able to continue to provide for its own security. So the allies in Chicago will be discussing what our commitment is to sustainable Afghan security forces over time. Essentially, what is the size of the Afghan army and police that the Afghan government believes they need to secure their country, and then what kind of support can we provide to them, whether it's training or direct assistance. The United States, like many other countries within NATO and ISAF, has also been negotiating a strategic partnership with Afghanistan, which will define the relationship between our 2 countries on the other end of transition. And that's going to mean cooperation in the security area, of course, but in many other areas, on the economic side, education, and Afghanistan's commitment to human rights and women's rights. And I saw today, for instance, that there was a remarkable event here in Chicago where a school here was linked up to an Afghan school, and those kids were able to communicate across an enormous geographic divide. It speaks to the type of people-to-people bonds and exchanges that can define a relationship when you're able to move beyond a period of war. And again, from where we sit, our objectives were what they were when we went in after 9/11, which was to defeat al-Qaeda, deny them a safe haven. In doing so, we think that we can leave behind a better Afghanistan and an Afghanistan that can provide for its people and have better relationships with the United States, with NATO member states, and the rest of the world. So this will be a major milestone in our Afghanistan policy and a key outcome of the Chicago summit. I just end on this concept of alliances one more time because they too are a unique asset of the United States and of the 3 countries that are joining us today and of all of our NATO allies. When you think about it, not only is NATO the strongest alliance in the world, it's unique. Other countries don't have alliances like this. They don't have a network of so many countries that share their values and their interests. That's something that America can count on. That's something that each of these three countries can count on. We're force multipliers for each other. And we're far stronger when we're able to act together and we're able to count on each other in international forums. That obviously begins with the core commitment of NATO, the Article 5 commitment that an attack on one is an attack on all. At the Baltic event earlier, we were able to reflect on how powerful that commitment is to countries that have only known independence now for 2 decades, but have the confidence that not just the United States, but all of NATO is going to protect their sovereignty as preciously as we would protect our own. And for Americans who might not have the same experience of knowing that just 20 years ago they could make their own decisions about their foreign policies and their future, we should keep in mind that it was Article 5 that was invoked on our behalf after the 9/11 attacks when our allies stood up and said that they would be with us. And 10 years after those attacks, often in unpopular circumstances, candidly, you still have so many NATO member states fighting alongside our troops in Afghanistan and training Afghan government officials, Afghan security forces alongside us. So the Article 5 commitment really binds us together and runs both ways. But again, I think what the new allies show us, and I use the phrase new allies knowing that Liz is going to come up here and quote the president as always. His comment is there's no such thing as new allies and old allies, they're just allies. But what those new member states who've come into NATO in the recent decades remind us is that we can never take for granted how precious this alliance is, that history is never that far behind us, and that we cannot grow complacent, and that the values that make us all a part of one alliance are things that are truly worth fighting for. So I think that's what guides us, that's what animates us going forward, and I think each of these three countries, Lithuania, Romania, and the Czech Republic, have proven to be steadfast allies of the United States, countries that are moving in remarkably positive directions. So we very much look forward to the opportunity to have a continued dialogue about this. Liz here can now speak in some more detail about our NATO agenda. But again, I would like to personally thank all of you in the city of Chicago for rolling out the red carpet. I'm a former Chicago native, well, not native. I lived here for a year and a half during the campaign. It felt like longer than that. There are many nights that I walked out of 233 North Michigan at 11:30, not to go home, but to go buy Red Bull at the supermarket across the street. So a lot of my Chicago time was spent inside that campaign office, but it had great views. So I at least was able to look out at Michigan Avenue and think about what a wonderful city this is. So we think it's going to be a great showcase. Chicago is going to put on a great show and a great summit. It shows the best of the United States. It shows, again, the best of the diversity that binds us together with so many of our allies like the three we're here with today. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to Liz.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which has done such a terrific job of helping us do outreach to our citizens, because this alliance is only as strong as the publics that support it, and the public education component of the work we're doing has been fundamental to the project of hosting the largest international event that the President will host this year in his hometown. And as Ben said, he has been bragging a little about it. The Council is one of many think tanks we've been working with this year to highlight the critical issues that the President will discuss with his counterparts when they come together on the 20th and 21st of May here in Chicago. This is the third NATO summit that has been hosted in the United States since the alliance was formed in 1949, and it's the first time one has ever been held outside of Washington. What I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about why NATO is a pillar of international peace and security long after the Cold War, which was its original reason for being, is over. What relevance it has in the 21st century to the challenges that we face, and how it reflects the totality of our international engagement in the Obama administration. So I'm going to go back to the very beginning because I had the good fortune to accompany the President to his first NATO summit just 2.5 months after he became President. This summit had been on the international calendar long before he was elected and inaugurated. It was in April of 2009. and he traveled to Strasbourg, France. The summit was split. Half was in Strasbourg, France, and half was across the border in Kiel, Germany, to attend the 60th anniversary summit of NATO, at which the new Secretary General Rasmussen, was selected. And I want to read to you what he said at that event. "We cannot be content to merely celebrate the achievements of the 20th century or enjoy the comforts of the 21st century. We must learn from the past to build on its success. We must renew our institutions, our alliances. We must seek the solutions to the challenges of this young century." Over the past 3 years, these words have guided our work. We had a mandate from the President to revitalize NATO and ensure that it remained the most successful alliance in human history. It's also true that this alliance requires stewardship, and NATO is at its best when it is led by the United States. President Obama has provided the leadership that NATO has needed to reweave the fabric of an alliance that was badly frayed through a series of commitments abroad that challenged Allied unity. He came into office knowing that Europe's trust in the alliance matters and that we had to rebuild the confidence of our allies in order to achieve our global goals. He also believed that NATO serves as the nexus of our transatlantic relationships and that therefore NATO needed to remain strong for the relationships to flourish. Today, in significant measure due to these efforts, NATO stands united as an alliance. We saw this agreed in the strategic concept that was published in Lisbon in the end of 2010, which set forth the goals of this alliance, its missions and priorities. And it was really a way of stating, it's almost like a constitution for the alliance, what its commitments are going forward. I'd like to talk to you about the vitally important current operations that flow from that strategic concept, most prominently, as Ben said, in Afghanistan, but also in other places in the world. Our work together to make sure that the alliance is equipped to face the challenges ahead, not just the challenges of today, and our emphasis on valuable partnerships and relationships with organizations and countries that support NATO's missions and its values. These three areas, Afghanistan, defense capabilities, and relations with non-NATO members, are the focus of our work for the NATO summit 3 weeks from now, what bureaucrats call deliverables. On NATO missions, NATO has never had the op-tempo, that's a military term for describing the pace of operations, that it has today. It is busier than ever. In Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in the Mediterranean, and off the Horn of Africa, there are alliance military operations underway. The alliance also concluded a successful operation in Libya, as Ben mentioned, last year, which prevented a tragic loss of innocent lives. It's interesting to note how many soldiers are deployed under NATO flags, because you may not be aware of this. There are 125,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. More than 3,000 miles from NATO's headquarters, not only are 28 NATO allies serving together, but 22 non-NATO partner countries stand with us in Afghanistan. Essentially, a quarter of the world's nations have forces under NATO's command in Afghanistan. And here I would highlight this crucial point that NATO has a standing integrated military command structure. It's the only organization on earth that has this. And that means that there's a multinational command with members of the militaries of all the 28 members who work together every day to make the alliance work. And they plan doctrine, and they train, and they exercise, and they equip, and they deploy when there's a mission that the alliance is committed to. And this is the daily business of this alliance. It doesn't come together as a coalition of the willing. It's prepared to respond any day for any contingency. And here, the Libya operation was a good case in point. Within 9 days of the United Nations Security Council blessing an operation to protect Libyan citizens, NATO planes were up in the skies, including the participation, as Ben mentioned, of a number of Gulf Cooperation Council countries. In addition, NATO has nearly 5,000 soldiers maintaining peace in the Balkans, which is really an element of unfinished business in Europe, where there is still the potential for conflict, which we saw so dramatically and tragically in the 1990s. And there are 2,000 NATO naval personnel conducting operations on the high seas, trying to prevent piracy and ensure freedom of passage. So we celebrate what NATO is doing and also want to make sure that in the future NATO can continue operating at this level. And because of that, the President directed us to pursue a very, very deliberate and systematic effort to assess what kinds of capabilities the alliance needed for the future. Not just the capabilities we inherited at the end of the Cold War and not just the capabilities that we need today, but what are the threats out there that we face or may face or will face that we need to plan for and equip for now. And those military capabilities span a number of domains. I'm going to describe some of the ones that we decided were the most important for NATO to field now and what will be agreed upon at the upcoming summit. The best example of the President's commitment to NATO's capabilities and European security, looking ahead at new threats, is in the domain of missile defense. There is a proliferation of ballistic missiles to countries that we'd prefer did not have them, but since they do, we know that it's important that we develop capabilities to deter those threats and, if necessary, to defend our country and our allies from those threats should a country choose to launch a ballistic missile in our direction. In the 2010 Lisbon summit, it was agreed that NATO would develop a ballistic missile defense capability, and the United States is providing the bulk of that architecture. We committed to deploying this as quickly as possible because we assessed that there was an emerging threat to Europe. And so in 2011, we were able to reach agreement with a number of allies to station elements of this architecture in Europe. And in the end of 2011, we were able to declare operational the first phase of the missile defense program. What we are working toward now is to transfer the command and control for the European element of our missile defense to our NATO command structure. And we hope that we'll be able to do that at the summit in a few weeks' time. Another element of our capabilities initiatives relates to the importance of having sufficient intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in today's world. We saw in the Libya operation that even our most capable allies did not have sufficient, what we call ISR, that's the acronym, for doing the kind of work we did together over Libya. And therefore, we have made a major push to encourage allies to pool and share resources and buy ISR capabilities that will be dedicated to the alliance. This is called the Alliance Ground Surveillance Program, and again, we will reach agreement at the summit for NATO to acquire a long-range unmanned aerial vehicle capability that would frankly not be affordable to individual allies. But in a time of constrained budgets, we judged that it was very important that the alliance acquire this capability, and so we've worked to do it as a collective effort, in which the whole will definitely be greater than the sum of its parts. There are a number of other capabilities initiatives that we expect to announce at the summit, so I would encourage you to watch this space when we get to Chicago, because the leaders will be talking about them, and I think we can be very proud of the work we have done to ensure that this alliance remains vital and capable of living up to the Article 5 commitment that Ben described, in which we have said to one another, an attack on one is an attack on all. Ben also noted the importance of partnerships, and here I want to highlight how we are working with NATO partners. This has been a critical priority for the President as well, because although NATO is an originally regionally rooted alliance based in Europe, created to defend Europe against the Soviet threat in 1949, the threats we now face together are global. And so it's been very important to develop NATO's role as the hub of a global network of security partners. We train and we conduct exercises, and we plan and we engage in a wide range of political consultations with our partners. In many cases, NATO's partners hope that they will eventually become NATO's members, and we have used the partnership to stimulate and incentivize reforms in the security sector, encouraging countries to develop civilian control of the military, more professional soldiers, and reduce old weapons stockpiles. And in the conduct of NATO operations, as I said, we have partners deployed all across the world. Indeed, there are more than 6,000 troops from partner countries who are supporting NATO's efforts in Afghanistan and the Balkans. And again, that means countries that are not members of NATO do not benefit from the Article 5 guarantee, but want to partner with NATO because they see the value of the relationship with the 28 NATO members. And this significantly reduces the burden on us. Our partners also contribute financially to our operations, conduct training for local forces to help make them self-sufficient, and add political support and legitimacy around the world. At next month's summit, the President asked that we organize events that would highlight and showcase the contributions of capable partners, and we're working to achieve that goal. So also on that point, I would encourage you to watch this space because there should be some events which give credit to those partners who have stepped forward and committed substantially to NATO operations. Let me pause on Russia because Russia is a partner of NATO and has been since the mid-1990s when I worked at the Pentagon. In fact, we just marked the 15th anniversary of NATO-Russia cooperation. I was in Brussels the first time a Russian defense minister walked into the hallowed halls of NATO, which for the Russians, of course, was the center of, from their perspective, the evil empire. NATO was the place that planned to respond to a Soviet attack and was designed to contain the Soviet threat. And in an effort to extend a hand to the Russians and show that after the end of the Cold War, we were serious about trying to transform the international security landscape, we invited the Russian defense minister to come to NATO. We have done a great deal of work since then to try to build a partnership with Russia. As you know, this has also been a signature Obama administration initiative. Last week in Brussels, Secretary Clinton met with all of the NATO foreign ministers and the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, to discuss a range of issues. There are a number of areas in which Russia and NATO cooperate. For example, Russia has provided substantial support for the transit of materiel to Afghanistan. It's a significant conduit for supplies and personnel as well. It also participates in counter-narcotics efforts with us, and we have invited Russia to participate in the meeting of ISAF leaders who will convene at the summit on the 21st of May. There are also obviously areas in which we disagree with Russia, and one of the areas of disagreement is about the freedom that countries should have to choose their alliances, and we have been absolutely unflinching on this point. NATO's door remains open to those countries that qualify for membership, and countries can be free to seek that membership and should not be subjected to undue Russian pressure. We have also been very clear about our disagreement with Russia with regard to Georgia and its territorial integrity. Russia has recognized 2 breakaway regions of Georgia that are currently occupied by Russian troops, and we do not recognize those breakaway regions and continue to work hard to try to ensure that peace and stability prevails in the Caucasus region. The Russians also have questioned our missile defense initiative, which I described earlier, and the President has been very clear that while we seek cooperation with Russia on missile defense and can see value for both NATO and Russia in that cooperation, going forward, we are committed to ensuring that NATO will be defended by NATO with a missile defense architecture that will be provided by the United States. I want to conclude by saying something that Ben already said. As he noted, I would say it, because it's important for the countries who are represented here tonight, who are new allies, to feel confident that they're not seen as new allies. In this alliance, when a country is taken in, it belongs at the table. And you know full well that every country of the 28 has the same influence, the same vote. It's only by consensus that things are achieved at NATO. And we welcome the leadership, the energy, the imagination, and the courage of the countries that emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union and who came out of the Warsaw Pact and who joined NATO since the end of the Cold War. Indeed, when the Vice President traveled to Central and Eastern Europe earlier in the administration, he said something in Bucharest, in Romania, in the great library there that was very powerful. He spoke about not what we can do for our Central and Eastern European allies, but rather in terms of what we can and must do together. And our message there was that you have the opportunity to lead because you have been through an experience that is recent with achieving freedom and building new institutions, democratic institutions, building market economies that are competitive. And that is an example for many, both to your east, where there is still democratic progress to be made in countries as tormented as Belarus, in countries facing challenges like Ukraine, also in the Caucasus region, and of course further afield, where some of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have played leadership roles already in working with the governments of the Arab Spring countries who are struggling to build new institutions. So, for example, Poland and Lithuania have played very significant roles already, and we look to doing more in partnership with our Central and Eastern European allies where they can set such a powerful example. So we remain excited about this alliance and very optimistic about its strength for the future. And I hope that you will enjoy having this major event in Chicago in a few weeks' time, which will celebrate this community and America's leadership in the world. Thank you.
Go.
So this is a wonderful opportunity. I usually see these three gentlemen in my office at the White House. They come to visit me with all of the work that we're doing together on our bilateral agenda as well as on our NATO agenda. And then, of course, Ben and I spend lots of time together in the Situation Room. But I have the privilege of having a conversation with you in front of a big audience instead of just with our small staffs. I thought I would give you an opportunity to speak about how NATO membership has affected your countries, because I characterized it, but I think it would be very interesting for our audience to hear what NATO membership has meant for your countries and how your security policies have evolved as a result of being members of NATO. So Petr, do you want to start, our ambassador from the Czech Republic?
Well, thank you very much for having us here. It's a great privilege and opportunity. I think the importance of NATO membership for the Czech Republic, and I don't want to speak for our friends, but I would say that it is the same with all Central and Eastern European countries, cannot be overestimated. It is basically the final tearing down of the Berlin Wall. It's not only the security, but it's also very much a civilizational issue. It's definitely being in a same civilization circle to which we always belonged, and as a result of the results of the Second World War, we were not allowed to belong for long 40 years. And I wish to use this opportunity for thanking the US because in 1999 it must not have been easy for the United States, for its citizens, for its political leaders to open the doors for new members coming from the old Soviet-led empire, so to say, for countries which you may not have known very much about what its leadership is going to say, how they will act as allies, as partners, and if they would not sort of abuse the most precious unanimity principle for their own purposes. I mean, the unanimity is such a precious thing in NATO, but on the other hand, you may pretty much imagine how it is difficult to arrive to a consensus where everybody has a veto, and yet the US was prepared to welcome the three in 1999, and the others, my friends, in 2004 to NATO, and I think we have proven that it was a good decision.
I would just say that we have many of the citizens of this community and some of our leaders to thank for these decisions that were taken. They were bold decisions, and today it was announced that President Obama will award Madeleine Albright the Medal of Freedom. And she was such an advocate for the membership of countries in Central and Eastern Europe and is playing a very significant role in outreach for the summit as well. So we have, the communities here are to be appreciated. To our ambassador from Lithuania, Žygis Paviljonis, would you like to speak next?
Yes, and I would maybe like to continue this dialogue between Ben and you about all the new alliances. And, you know, when I consider Lithuanian case, we are really very old friend of America. Some time ago, together with Poles, Jews, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, we had big empire back in Europe. And by the end of 18th century, we've been kind of infected by American virus of freedom. We established the first written constitution in Europe that was really free with all kind of liberties you had here. And in 3 years, we've been destroyed by 3 autocratic empires. And our generals, like General Kosciuszko, he fled to America to fight for your freedom. So tomorrow we will celebrate his contribution to American freedom in West Point that was established by my general. So our story is quite old. And then it was a period of suffering, occupations, and totalitarian regime who was sweeping my country back and forth. So for me, kind of answering to your question, the membership in NATO is the end of all suffering. Where finally we've been able to create the life that we've been always trying to create back in Europe for all those ages. And I'm really grateful also for this city, because in this city I have, 500,000 of Lithuanians, and in America it's 1/4 of my nation who've been working together to achieve that goal. I still remember President Reagan marching in one of the districts, Market Park, full of Lithuanians with slogan, "I love Lithuanians." So, you know, you helped us so much, and we're back.
And Adrian Vierita, our ambassador from Romania.
Well, thank you so much, and allow me to continue and thank all of you for this, I would say, excellent initiative. I'd like to congratulate the Chicago Council. And I'd also like to give public recognition to the Central European American communities in the United States, and especially in Chicago. I'd like to salute the Romanian American community because they were staunch supporters of Romania joining NATO. And I really don't know. I mean, it's, if this is NATO membership, it's the end of all suffering. It's a different kind of responsibility.
Yes.
But in Romania's case, it was, well, actually, I think I can agree with both my colleagues and friends in Washington, from Washington, that they also spoke on my behalf and on our behalf. But it was like coming back to the family. And it was the NATO membership aspiration was a catalyst for transforming my country, for transforming Romania, for transforming that part of Europe. And because it was about values, and last but not least, it was about the United States. Because without your help, we couldn't have done it. And that's why I'd like to thank you, all of you, for your support.
May I ask? I'd like to build on that and ask you, going forward, what are the ways we can do a better job of involving the communities that you represent and those that your colleagues who aren't here on the podium with you represent in supporting our alliance going forward? Do you have suggestions for how to do more? I guess you always have suggestions for how to do more.
Well, Of course. Well, I agree that this is not the end of the suffering. This is the end of new free world where we have to make choices and to make our world even better because, well, we have a lot of threats. Lithuania was recently chairing Community of Democracies, and we've been counting with our friends how many democracies we have in the world, and actually we were quite saddened that, it's maybe a decade or so, number of democracies actually were increasing. Well, that was before Arab Spring and so on, but the pressure on democracies, it's huge outside and inside, especially after economic crisis, societies are radicalizing and so on. So we have to do a lot in order to expand that family of free and democratic nations because, threats are all around. And, well, I was saying today to Liz and Ben, well, let's think seriously. Lithuania will now preside over the European Union in 2013. What shall we do? Well, I think we should really try to think how do we strengthen our economic side of relations. We did a lot in our nice and cozy Nordic Baltic region. We did a lot inside EU. But for me, America and Europe, that's actually the same family. So what should we do in order to strengthen our economic and trade relations? What should we do in order to create the most competitive and most innovative market in the world in order to withstand all those pressures? And, well, my answer is just to use Lithuanians, They are all around in America. Let's think together.
Would you like to answer this also or no?
I leave it.
Nope, okay.
Just make
Well,
it.
I cannot but agree. There is an excellent bilateral cooperation between Lithuania and Romania and between our communities here. So let's do it. Coming back to NATO, I think speaking about the future of NATO, which, well, we hope that, and some of us are convinced that NATO will continue to have a bright future. But I think one of the most important issues here is how to prepare NATO, how to have NATO be adaptable, how to adapt NATO to the emerging risks or threats of the future, which are changing. Because we are living in a totally different way. I'm not telling you something that you wouldn't know, but in the international environment is today different than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And I think this is a challenge for all of us, how to make NATO remain what it is, strengthening the political commitment, or continue to strengthen the political, because it's no one, I think, has doubts about this, and enhancing the capabilities.
So on that point, we are all facing significant budgetary challenges, but we also have learned lessons from the deployment in Afghanistan. And one has been the importance of being mobile and deployable at long distance. And we have realized, of course, that many of the militaries that were built to fight the Soviet Union are not equipped properly or trained to face the kinds of challenges that present themselves. And so what we are doing both nationally and in NATO together is trying to think through this very challenge. How do we prepare not only to do what we need to do today, but be capable tomorrow? And this issue of being much more adaptable and rapidly deployable, lighter, and more agile is very important. And there's a great deal of work we need to do with our allies to ensure that our allies are able to keep up with us as we move. Our technology is very advanced and it's very costly. And so one of the projects we have, as I noted in my remarks, is to work together to try to ensure that there is sufficient capability in NATO that we can continue to operate together.
May I?
Yes, absolutely, Petr.
I think that you're touching the most difficult issue of what NATO is now facing. It's the economic crisis on both sides of the Atlantic, denting the budgets for the military. And we have to admit that in Europe there are very few countries that honor its commitment to set aside 2% of its national product to the defense. The US has its own problems with budget cuts, and we first cannot leave that being. I think that we have to assure ourselves that while this is some phase, some crisis that we have to overcome, improving or increasing our military spending is the goal. But at the same time, we have to do better, obviously. The Article 5 is a good thing, but it doesn't say how we achieve the Article 5 capabilities. And you know that so far every state has been sort of selecting its own systems. The purchases are very much separate. And even though in Europe you have states that are very much one space, even from the strategic point of view, still it has been difficult to sit together and say, okay, we'll buy this, you buy that, we'll pool and share. And I think that this crisis, if it has to have any meaning, it should have this meaning that it will teach us to be smarter and to use our limited resources in a more effective way. You said some of the examples. I think that Jigis may talk about the policing over the air of the Baltics. I may inform you about a project to train helicopter pilots in the Czech Republic and in Croatia. That's a bilateral project. So these are signs that these countries are able to simply realize that it's no longer possible to do everything separately on our own, inefficiently, but there is a great push towards a much more smarter approach.
This would be a silver lining in a big gray cloud. Yes? One more thing?
Yeah,
yes.
I can just contribute in absolute agreement with you. Well, for example, in Lithuania, we are quite good with special forces who are fighting somewhere in the south of Afghanistan. We run the whole PRT in Gore. We even with the huge budget cuts that we had during economic crisis, we didn't touch the Afghanistan line. We are even thinking about increasing it. But at the same time, we have no funds to buy planes that would safeguard our airspace. And that's why this concept of Baltic air policing that hopefully will be approved in Chicago Council is so important. This is one of the examples of the smart defense where other NATO members are helping us to do it. And as I was joking today, you know, that's maybe because of another virus we got from Chicago. It's basketball. We know how to play smart in defense, kind of, and that's working.
So I think we're going to open it up to audience questions. I have just one last question for you. I noted in my remarks that we have to build and sustain public support for our alliance going forward. And in particular, given that the generation that is your children, our children, was not alive during the Cold War and doesn't appreciate the meaning of NATO automatically, how do the next generation in your countries, the young people, college students, young adults, how do they see NATO, and how can it be more relevant to them?
Well, again, another very sensitive nerve. Let's face it, the young generation, it's a generation that never lived under totalitarian regime and may have the tendency to take freedom and security for granted. You must see that in Europe we have not had war in 70 years almost, which is, by the way, a great success both of NATO as well as of European Union. And having not had any sort of situation means that the younger generation all over the continent has sort of tendency to underestimate the importance of the security cooperation among democratic countries. And again, when it comes to budget, when it comes to difficult decision which costs to reduce, politically, it is always very difficult to defend defense costs against education, against culture or whatever else. So I think this is one of the greatest challenges to keep these things important even among young generation, who will be those who will actually decide in the future what will be the priority of our countries.
Sigis?
Well, I have again the solution. I think you have this time you have to take people from America and bring to Lithuania. Why? When you are on the border with something, you kind of understand why NATO is important. We have no problem of this kind in Lithuania because just 20 kilometers from my office windows we have Belarus, and you see what kind of regime is there, how people are kind of happy, and you understand why NATO is important. So please come to Vilnius.
Adrian?
Well, the problem here is that I cannot argue with neither Ziggy nor Peter, because I think they are absolutely right. Sometimes I can also feel that there is a tendency that democracy is taken for granted. And, well, in a way it is good because, it's sustaining the morale. And that. But I think public diplomacy here, I'm not sure that I'm using the right term, but I think public diplomacy has a big role to play. And I'd like to, allow me to commend the work of the department led by Ambassador Kitarovic, and who is a dear friend of ours, and is doing an excellent job in Brussels. I think that here we need to connect maybe better with, and I stand to be corrected, with the concepts on public diplomacy of the member states in order to ensure that young generations will continue to see NATO the way we see it.
Thank you. I think, yes, thank you.
I'd like to mention one more Chicago contribution, which is the former Lithuanian President Valdas Adamkus, whose one of the main goals of his term was that Lithuania would be accepted into NATO and the European Union. And of course, all the Lithuanian Americans and the Lithuanians in Lithuania were very grateful when this was achieved. So thank you very much. Continue the air patrol.
Thank you.
Okay, next question there from the back row, please.
Currently, the focus of NATO is in the Arab world. Now, my question is mostly for Ben and Elizabeth. What is NATO currently doing to overcome the severe deficit of trust and possibly legitimacy, especially coming the Iraq war? What are we currently doing to kind of overcome that in reaching out to the Arab world?
Sure. I can offer a few thoughts. I think in both the Arab world and in Afghanistan, there's a very complicated relationship that is associated with trust. It's manifested, I think, most clearly right now in Afghanistan because there's obviously an ongoing conflict there. And on the one hand, you have very much a demand for engagement by NATO. The Afghans understand that there's a need for an international security force to continue to blunt the momentum of the Taliban and create space for their own government to get stronger. And there's also a need for NATO and the unique capabilities that NATO has to train their security forces. On the other hand, when you have the presence of foreign troops for so long, sovereignty issues become more and more important, and it begins to grate. And that's a normal tension, and it's to be expected that, again, people would want to determine their own destiny, just like every country represented here on stage. So there's this balance between a desire for NATO to help fix the challenges in Afghanistan and in the broader region in some respects, but then there's a resistance to feeling like you're giving up sovereignty for that. So that's the tension that we're seeking to mitigate. In Afghanistan, that's why this framework that we have is so important, the handover to the Afghans, because it says, here's the timeline under which you're going to get back full sovereignty, full responsibility for your country, so you can see it. Yes, we're going to be here for a period of time because we believe, and you believe too, that we need to be here to help, again, make sure there are no terrorist safe havens. But you can see in a very methodical way how this war is going to end. And the plan that we've reached on transition maps out, literally, here are the districts, here are the provinces going to transition. And so ultimately, if we can show that we're moving in that direction of restoring full Afghan sovereignty and responsibility for their country, I think we can, again, get at that trust issue and that unease at giving up sovereignty. I think in the Arab world, more broadly, Libya has the potential to be a significant event in the sense that you had a demand from an Arab populace, an Arab public, for essentially NATO and the West to intervene, which is unusual given the recent history in the region. And what was so unique about Libya is we didn't put forces on the ground. It was the Libyans who did the work on the ground. What NATO did is, from the air, we created zones around the country where civilians were protected, and they could organize, and they could have space, and they weren't being murdered by the regime. And then they themselves, on the ground, ended the Gaddafi regime, which is an interesting model. And no two interventions are the same. But this concept, again, of NATO supporting people as they fulfilled their aspirations, again, was an interesting model that built trust. And I think if you were probably to poll Arab countries, the country that has the most trust in NATO right now would probably be Libya, which is interesting. But again, I think it's always a balance where there's a demand for NATO action, NATO engagement, but then with that NATO engagement comes, again, a sense of a loss of sovereignty, and that's what we need to balance. And that's where the partnership thing comes in. Because here we can go to nations in the region and say, we're not going to do this for you. We want to be partners with you, equal partners. We want to have countries in the Arab world, starting with those who joined us in Libya, like the UAE and Qatar and Jordan, but potentially other countries. Who knows, maybe potentially a democratic Libya at some point. Be partners with NATO so that they can see a relationship where we're equals. And it's not simply us dictating terms, but it's us sitting around a table and working out with them how we're going to deal with common challenges. So I think we have a huge opportunity here in the coming years as we've already wound down Iraq, as we wind down the war in Afghanistan and transition sovereignty and responsibility there to the Afghans, and we build these partnerships to have a different type of relationship with that part of the world than we've had these last 10 years.
I'll just add one point, which is that there are two NATO allies who have significant Muslim populations. One is a new ally, Albania. The other is Turkey, huge country straddling a bridge between the West and the East. And just last week, the Turks requested to brief NATO on the situation in Syria. And they have been a critically important partner for us in much of the work we have been doing in the Arab Spring. The President has invested a great deal in the development of a constructive working relationship with Prime Minister Erdogan. And we see that as a very important element of ensuring that NATO is viewed as a partner rather than as an adversary in the region that you're describing.
Yeah, the gentleman right here in the yellow tie, please.
Yellow tie. Hi. My question is about the expansion of NATO that we've been talking about. I personally support it. I think it's a good thing. But in the age of austerity as it was, are we concerned at all that we may be overstretching the limits of what NATO can do, considering that it was primarily designed to operate in Europe?
Who'd like to? Would somebody from?
I'll make an opening comment, and our colleagues may want to add something. What I would say is that this concept of smart defense and the type of burden sharing that was discussed is incredibly important in an age of austerity. Part of the kind of miracle of NATO is that you would have had 100 years ago 28 countries building armed forces that could fight each other in a war. And therefore, as they designed their defense spending, they'd be thinking about kind of having a self-sustaining A to Z military that could engage in a conflict. If we get this right within NATO, even in an age of reduced budgets, different countries come forward with different capabilities and different specializations and different areas of expertise and interest. And then, therefore, you end up with a situation where the whole is far greater than the parts. That's the model that we're driving towards. And that's why NATO is such a unique asset, because within an alliance framework, you can count on your ally to come forward with a capability that, again, adds to something where you might have a need. And that allows us to do more within NATO, but also beyond the borders of NATO. And I think, part of what this gets at is when you look at the emerging threats, they're not masses of land armies. So you can make reductions there. And some of the reductions that the United States is making in its defense spending are kind of Cold War systems, Cold War footprints that were designed for the Soviets. Well, now we can focus on and frankly, looking forward, we're moving beyond the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Very expensive stability operations, right? And as those budget numbers come down, we can look at new capabilities like cyber, where we have an emerging threat, piracy, where we have an emerging threat. Again, the type of surveillance capabilities that Liz spoke of that are critical to counterterrorism and other missions and counter narco-trafficking. So we can, in other words, both burden share and have a multiplier within the alliance, but we can also, frankly, get rid of some of the capabilities we don't need anymore, and capabilities that were really about a European land war in some respects, and move them over to the threats we face today, which means making sure we can keep our Article 5 commitments within Europe and doing the contingency planning necessary for that, but then also making sure we can deal with threats that are beyond those borders, and frankly, even in domains like cyber that are hard to put on a map.
I think the Czech ambassador would like to add to that.
Well, I just wanted to add that I think that keeping the door open is not overstretching, is basically a smart way to go. On the contrary, because these countries who see the prospect of becoming member of NATO, they do a lot of effort in stabilizing themselves, in basically aiming all their policies towards democracy and stability. So they are doing the job for the stabilizing of the region, and I would just take the example of Croatia and Albania, two countries which in different times were at war. Albania with its own, or within its own, Croatia with its neighbors, and we have Bosnia-Herzegovina and Montenegro and Macedonia in this region as partners who are basically preparing themselves to enter NATO. This is not going to happen here in Chicago, but hopefully in some near future. So expanding NATO is not overstretching, is expanding the area of stability and democracy.
Yes.
And I would really add to my colleague, actually even vice versa, in Central Europe, we are complaining. We say, well, you know, we joined NATO, but where is the NATO infrastructure? Where are those footprints? You know, we are competing with each other to get those. But the power of the nation that was released after our membership in NATO and the EU is immense. We have growing economies. We contribute a lot. We create, you know, playground for all our investors. We have a lot of American investors today in Lithuania. It's just a win-win. And actually, it's not only economy. It's also about kind of, you know, moral obligation. If you have 50 million of Ukrainians still fighting for freedom, or 10 million of Belarusians, you know, who can deny their right to live free? You know, or Russians, you know, those Democrats in the streets. You never know. One day they will be part of our European structures. But, you know, we should help them. We have no right to deny that right to live the same life you've been enjoying here for 200 years.
From the ambassador from Romania?
Well, thank you. Another reading that I'm having, reading of what the ambassador of Lithuania said, is that you can be optimistic about the Eurozone future, because this is the economy in Europe will improve. And this would allow European countries and European allies to better pool and share the resources. Actually, this is also one of the issues that we are having in our discussions between NATO and the EU, because some countries are the same and they resort to the same capabilities. But I hope, coming back to expansion, I hope that in Chicago we'll have a message, a good message, a sound message regarding the future enlargement, even if we probably won't invite new members. But this is important also because we'll continue some commitments that we have made during some other summits.
Okay, we have time for one last very brief question. Yeah, the gentleman there in the second to last row.
The defense integration of NATO has been very important. What chances there are having an economic integration in NATO, amongst the NATO countries, especially in Eastern Europe? And this is from someone who's Romanian in extract.
Well, this is a very good question, I think. Well, if we consider the concept that we have talked about here, the smart defense concept, for instance, trying to achieve more with less, doing it in a very smart way. This can be a form of integration. I'm not thinking of an economic integration among NATO members as the form of integration that we have within the European Union. But I think that we can partner in such a way that at the end our capabilities will eventually be enhanced. And cooperating better with the European Union not only in Europe. Let's take the example of Afghanistan, where we have to complete the transition to full Afghan security responsibility. But also, we can do with the European Union a lot of work, hopefully good work. And the European Union is negotiating an agreement with the Afghan authorities on that. So I think there are avenues to be explored here. And this is why the Chicago summit is so important, because it will probably show the road ahead.
Thank you.
We are confident that this is...
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you please to remain seated before we thank our panelists, because they have a flight to catch from O'Hare, so if you could just remain seated so we can talk. But if before then, you could please join me in thanking everybody for this fascinating discussion.